So the terms left and right and the concept of conservatism were never necessary outside of the paradigm of progress. And progress is the drive to get to the liberal ideal, which is us returning to the Garden of Eden, essentially. And the conservative is the person who says, yes, but. And the but is always, yes, that would be nice, but if we get there, damage is going to be done along the way. So we want to drive the speed limit, as Michael Malice puts it. We don't want to go too fast because you might hurt a lot of people, ruin a lot of good things that we have in the desire to get to the end state. And so the conservative is someone who consents to everything the liberal wants, but just wants to go a bit slower. And so when I say conservative, I do it just to make it easier for people to understand that I'm on the right rather than in favor of being on the right rather than on the left. But in reality, I don't really know what you would call someone who's not in favor of getting to that end state. Right? These days I call myself a traditionalist.
Yeah, I was going to say traditionalist.
Because I'm just in favor of a traditional society where we're kind of in our tribes, we live harmoniously with each other, we have families, relationships, we are part of our local communities, and these are all the things that liberalism attacks. You'll notice that everything liberalism attacks is the relationship between someone and something else, right? I mean, this is why they think that children are not owned by their parents, they're owned by the state. And if you think about it, well, no, what claim does the government have to my children? Right? Then, I mean, literally the words we use, they're my children. I'm their father. I belong to them as much as they belong to me, But the government will come in and say, no, we've decided for whatever reason we're going to take these away now. And they have the power to do it. And this is why the consent is the primary factor in liberal morality, and it interferes with many of our relationships. Because if you think about a lot of your relationships, they weren't consensual. You actually didn't choose a lot of your relationships. You had them put upon you, but that doesn't mean they're not good.
Certainly for the first couple
of decades of your life.
Yeah,
Right. But the state the liberal is constantly. I mean, you see it with politics all the time, where people on the left will denounce their own family members, and it's just like RFK had this recently, where he was like, "Look, I think it's got to be Trump because I don't like the Democrats where they're going." Suddenly, his family members are denouncing him. It's like, think of your relationship. You've known him your entire life. Party first. And it should be relationships first. The way that you treat your family, your friends, the people, your neighbors, these are all your relationships, and they are the most important thing about your life. The entire good of human life comes from the quality of your relationships. If you don't have good relationships with the people around you, you have a miserable life. And that's why the left are such miserable shits. They really are, though, aren't they?
It's true.
They're all on antidepressants because their relationships are bad. And it's because they lent into liberalism so heavily that they damaged all of their relationships because of a very abstract political ideal that can never be brought about.
Yeah. Why do you think that Western countries in particular have been so susceptible to this over the last few decades? Because I often make the point that most people in the world are conservative or traditionalist. That's actually the human norm on a global scale. And it seems like countries in the Anglosphere and Western Europe, which is probably only about 1 billion people, we seem to be particularly susceptible to what's the right term? The excesses and the sort of cultural suicidal aspects, suicidal empathy of this sort of extreme, what I would argue is a kind of extreme form of liberalism or progressivism, where people in the government and even individuals are willing to put illegal immigrants over a native population, or willing to put the rights of criminals over the rights of the people they victimize.
The rights of men over women in women's spaces.
Exactly. There's this constant inversion going on. And then I look at other parts of the world, and it's funny, quite literally yesterday I was having dinner with my parents and some of my an aunt and uncle who are visiting from Nigeria. So everyone in this conversation, I believe, is 70 plus.
Right. And
I don't know how we got onto the conversation, but I was explaining, we ended up explaining the concept of pronouns, like they, them pronouns, and non-binary to my mom's older brother, who's in his 70s, and he never
70-year-old Nigerian man
lives in northern Nigeria.
What are you talking about?
He was like, but for a single person, like he was confused. He was like, you say they is or they we like, and his mind is the confusion in his face is just like, what on earth even like what even is this? And that would be the response to most people around the world on many of these issues. They're just like, what even are you talking about? So I'm just wondering, like, what's going on in the West? Like, how is this happening?
So I think it's because it's our tradition is liberalism, but we never called it that, right? So you can see the sort of genesis of this in, I mean, really deep back in the history of the English in particular, with things like Magna Carta, because what liberalism is the universalization of the rights of Englishmen. So the English were quite lucky in a way that after the Norman conquest, so nearly 1,000 years now, England hasn't been conquered by a foreign power. And so we haven't had to think of ourselves as being a people under the yoke of another people. Because that when that happens to a people, they get a very firm sense of their shared identity. You know, it's like the Jewish people in particular have a very strong sense of this because of the 2,000 years. So they understand themselves as being part of a sort of collective entity. But England's been a very safe place politically for the English. And so the concerns were not external because the enemies never really came close to taking England. So it became very internal. So it was oppression from the king was way more important, especially as the Normans were originally Vikings that had become Francoized, or however you describe it, become French. And then they brought a different kind of legal system to England, which had its own very tribal series of laws and relationships prior to that. And so the Magna Carta is a part of a sort of 200-year trek that the English people had to restrain the power of the king. Because the French have absolute monarchs, and this is the doctrine of absolute monarchy, really reaches a zenith under Louis XIV, who just comes out and says that I am the state. I am, and he has his palace in Versailles, and he has every noble in the country. Well, in the English-speaking world, it wasn't like that. The sort of Germanic tribes had restricted kingships. The king was not an absolute dictator of the country. The people themselves had rights. And this was preserved in England, probably because of its isolation and safety. And it becomes, through the medieval era, the rights of Englishmen. And the rights of Englishmen seem like a really good idea. The king can't just take your property. He can't come into your house. The king can't just arbitrarily arrest you. And if he does, you've got a right called habeas corpus that you can exercise against him, that the society itself will support you in because you were an Englishman. And so
but what if you posted a mean tweet?
Well, that's a great question. You'll notice that we don't have the rights of Englishmen anymore. We have human rights. And it was John Locke, the English liberal philosopher, who decided, well, these are just intrinsic rights of humans, right? So the English had spent, 500 years, however long, actually, fighting the government, having revolts, civil wars, to physically impose upon the sovereign the fact that we as Englishmen are not going to accept that anything less than this suite of rights. You are going to treat us in this particular way, and in turn we'll pay our taxes, we'll join your army, and we won't cause trouble, right? Now, this was abstracted by John Locke into being the rights of man. So if all men are the same, again, liberal philosopher, blank slate philosopher, if all men are the same, then all men must have the same rights. And that sounds like a good idea, but it turns out that the rights of Englishmen, they're parochial. I mean, they belong to an ethnic group, the English. They don't belong to the Irish, they don't belong to the French. And so these are based, and because of the long history of England, there's a series of social institutions and political institutions that are geared around accepting this. These are in the law. These are things that are in the law. Like you've got 18th century jurists, like who was it? Was it Blackstone or Dicey, who finally properly codified the rights of Englishmen and gave them the sort of real hard edge of law that they had always just informally had. And so you've got a series of institutions, and the society understands this is how we're going to operate. Well, if you take that away, then you say, right, I've got a doctrine of human rights now. So then if you apply that to another country, you say, well, this country isn't supporting the rights of Englishmen. It's like, well, no, in France, they weren't supporting the rights of Englishmen. That's true. Well, that means it all has to change. And so you have the French Revolution as a product of importing English rights into France, into what was feudal France, or the old regime it was called. And so they found, well, Frenchmen don't have the rights of Englishmen, but we want them to have the rights of Englishmen because the rights of Englishmen are good things. They're very good things to have. And throughout the Middle Ages, England was considered a place that had liberty. It was considered a free and happy country. I mean, they literally called it merry old England. And this is, people at the time literally called it this. And I mean, Rousseau writes about how he's kind of envious of the English. Voltaire is envious of the English because they look at the way that England's governed compared to medieval France. It's night and day. And it's because of the absolute power of the king and the aristocracy, and there's a lot to go into. But when you abstract that, you take away the institutions and the history. You say, well, look, there was a series of steps that the English took to get to that position, and it took 800 years, something like that. And you want it now. You want that now, overnight. It's like, well, that's not something you can just get overnight, at least not without a lot of bloodshed. And so you end up with the terror. You end up with the war in the Vendée. You end up invading various other countries and spreading the abstract ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity to everyone else. And this is a cascade of series of events. But it becomes destructive when it's applied to countries that aren't England. And then it becomes something that they can't let go. Because now, I mean, like, millions of people died in the Napoleonic Wars after the French Revolution. Like, we've bought into this with a lot of blood. And if we say, well, maybe it's not actually as good an idea as we think, then we condemn everything that we've done prior in the service of it. And the only reason that all of this is kind of swept aside is because, well, it was for a noble ideal. And it's like, okay, well, what if the ideal wasn't that noble, actually? That means for the last 300 years, everything about the Enlightenment essentially becomes evil. And I don't think anyone's prepared to do that. So, and it's not that everything about it was evil either. It was just a lot of blood has been shed over this. Not necessarily shed either. And it's become essentially our tradition. We can't help but be liberal in many, many ways. We can't bear ourselves to not be the other way, because it opens a Pandora's box about whether we were on the right side of history or not. And it turns out we might not have been.